UFC 250 is tonight. Arguably, the greatest women's mixed martial artist of all time is back in action tonight. You catch it on ESPN Plus pay-per-view. And the man who wrote an excellent article about Amanda Nunes, Marc Raimondi, joins us now on the Boardwalk Honda hotline on 97.3 ESPN. Mark, how you doing on this Saturday?
I'm good, man. How are you?
Doing pretty good. I really enjoyed your article about Nunes because I think it gives a great opportunity to show people about what differentiates her from so many of her competitors, why she has risen to the status of being the women's MMA GOAT, and that is she has a level of power and athleticism, and you got it from her own opponents. It's not just someone like you or me saying, hey, we've seen her fight, we see what she can do, or talk about fighting metrics. No, you're saying, listen, let me explain to you in your article, this is what the other fighters who have faced her say about her.
Yeah, and that was the exact point of doing something like that, because it's one thing, like you said, for an analyst or a journalist to talk or write about how good this woman is at fighting, but it's another thing to get the perspective from someone who's actually been in the cage with her and what that's like and that experience and just what it feels like to get hit by her. And I really enjoyed talking to all those ladies about their experience because she is different. I mean, there's no doubt. Every one of them said it's not the same going in there against Amanda Nunes, and I mean the results have kind of bore that out, right?
When you think about also where MMA is today, because obviously anyone who's followed the sport for a while, whether it's yourself or any of your colleagues over at ESPN, you guys know how far the sport has come over the last 20 years. And it's really only been the last several years that women's MMA has been in the top tier promotion, the UFC. So to see where the sport was years ago to where it is now, and to see where Amanda Nunes has risen, it's really impressive to see what she has been able to do in the UFC, considering the fact of where the sport was then versus now as well.
Yeah, and 100%, and I'm really excited to see where we are. It's been 7 years since there have been women in the UFC, and the UFC has been around for 26 years. So it's a small fraction of that time, and I'm really excited to see, man, where the women's game ends up in 5 years, 10 years from now, because you're seeing it right now, especially in the 115-pound women's division, where the athletes are getting better, the skills are getting better, the intensity of fights, they're always very high. But I mean, you talk about that Zhang Weili, Joanna Jędrzejczyk fight from March, and just one of the greatest fights in UFC history. Not one of the greatest women's fights in UFC history, one of the greatest fights, period, in MMA history. Just an incredible combination of skill, technique, tactics, toughness, and violence. I mean, it was truly a sight to behold. And Nunes is the current standard bearer for the heavier women. The bantamweight division, she's a champion. Featherweight division, she's a champion. But I mean, the continued evolution is something that I'm very, very excited to see.
If Nunes wins tonight as expected, what is next for her? Because in many ways, it feels like that she, like Valentina Shevchenko at 125, at 135 and 145, it just feels like Amanda is so far ahead of everyone else in her weight classes. So what is even next for her at this point?
Well, I do think that those two are on a collision course again. They've already fought 3 times. I mean, twice. This will be their 3rd time if they fight again. And Nunes has won the first 2, but it's not the traditional case of someone who's 2-0 against an opponent. The first fight was a 3-round fight. It was before both of them kind of hit their stride. That was back in 2016. So you can almost throw that one out because both of them have changed so much in 4 years. And then the next one was in 2017, and it was a 5-round fight. It was for the bantamweight title, and it was just razor close. You could have made just as good of an argument for Valentina Shevchenko to get the decision than Amanda Nunes getting the decision. And, inevitably it did go to Nunes, and she retained the bantamweight title, but it was a close fight. I don't think anyone will be upset about seeing that fight again. Nunes is going to have the size advantage, there's no doubt. Shevchenko is a flyweight champion. She moved down and she's been dominant. And much in the same way that their fighting her fighting peers gush about Amanda Nunes, it's very similar to Valentina Shevchenko. I don't think there's any doubt that right now in the UFC, those are the two best women's fighters on the roster.
And of course, tonight Amanda Nunes is fighting Felicia Spencer, UFC 250 on ESPN Plus pay-per-view. For those out there who don't know about Felicia Spencer, tell the audience why she is a threat in tonight's fight.
Well, if you don't know much about Felicia Spencer, the best thing you can do is to go back and watch UFC 240 from last July in Edmonton, and Felicia Spencer fought Chris Cyborg, and she hung. I mean, if you know anything about Chris Cyborg, her fights don't last a very long time. She goes in there and she pummels her opponents, and she's been one of the most dominant forces in all of MMA for 10 years. She's been a champion in multiple organizations. She's a champion now in Bellator. But Felicia Spencer lasted the entire 5 rounds with her. Actually was the first person to open up a cut on Chris Cyborg in an MMA fight. And again, her career spans more than 10 years. So the toughness, the durability, her ability to hang in there against someone like Cyborg, I wouldn't be surprised if it goes to decision. And then, gets into those late rounds, who knows what can happen. Cardio becomes a factor. Maybe, it's an empty arena. There's no crowd to keep the adrenaline up. You just never know. And Felicia Spencer has the skills on the feet. She has a good ground game. She's well-rounded. And she's just mentally tough. And I think it's going to be very, very interesting to see how this one plays out.
Also, you mentioned earlier about Valentina Shevchenko being the 125-pound champion, her size compared to Amanda. Well, Felicia is a bona fide 145er. She's actually fought at 155 as well. So, how much can the size of the opponent be involved in this for Amanda as well?
There's definitely a factor there, I would say, and that I think plays toward the toughness. So when Nunes fought Germaine Durandamy in her last fight back in December, it was not an easy fight for Nunes. It was the first time in a while that she hasn't just kind of run over her opponent, and it took a while. It took all 5 rounds. She actually lost, some striking exchanges. And Durandamy and look, they have 2 very different skill sets and body types, Durandamy and Felicia Spencer. But the one thing they have similar is they come from striking backgrounds, and they are bigger in size. Durandamy is tall. Spencer is very thickly built. She is a legitimate 145er, like you said. Durandamy has fought at 145 before. So as far as the size goes, these will be these two opponents in a row for Nunes will be among the bigger women that she has fought in the UFC. So that is 100% a factor.
Marc Raimondi joining us here on the Boardwalk on the Hotline on 97.3 ESPN. You can follow him on Twitter at Marc_Raimondi. Marc, also on the UFC 250 card tonight, not 1, not 2, but 3 bantamweight fights. And that's a big deal because with Henry Cejudo saying, okay, guys, I'm done. And all of a sudden you see him off in AEW flanking Mike Tyson for however that came about, which was hilarious and odd at the same time because I think Vitor Belfort was found out of a closet after 2 years. You look at the UFC now, they have an open opportunity for guys to go after that 135-pound belt. And a lot of those guys who are fighting tonight all have an opportunity to make a case.
It is not overstating it to say that UFC 250 will shape the future of the bantamweight division moving forward, especially this year, because you have, first of all, you have Aljamain Sterling versus Corey Sandhagen. And that seems like it's going to be a number 1 contender fight. The winner of that is going to get the next crack at the title. Now, who has the title? If it's not Cejudo, if he's retired, it looks like it's going to be Peter Yan versus Jose Aldo next month, possibly on Fight Island for the vacant bantamweight title. And the winner of this Sterling-Sandhagen fight should, by all accounts, be next for that. So that right there is the top of the division. Then you have Cody Garbrandt in the co-main event tonight against Rafael Assunção. Now, Garbrandt, a former champion, was at one point the face of the division. Someone the UFC thought was going to be one of the faces of the entire organization. He was a huge star 3-4 years ago, 2016, when he won the title, and they thought he was going to be a long-term, almost like another, maybe not quite on the level of Conor McGregor, but in that realm, in that spectrum of a big draw. He's lost 3 in a row. He's trying to get off the skid against Rafael Assunção in the co-main event. Great fight. And then you have a guy who's on the way up, Sean O'Malley, also on the main card in a bantamweight fight against veteran Eddie Wineland. And Sean O'Malley, if you ask anybody, he is the future of that division. He is a potential big star. So that division is one of my favorites in the UFC, and tonight is like an incredible showcase for the bantamweights.
You mentioned the Aldo Yan potential fight earlier. I'm still curious about what is going on with that because of the fact, Mark, and maybe you can answer this question. Why does the UFC seem so confident that Aldo can make 135? Because wasn't there at least a couple times that Aldo had trouble cutting to 145?
He did many times. That was always one of the issues in his career when he was at his peak and he was the 145-pound champion in the UFC, which he was for a very long time. That was always an issue. That was always a concern every fight week. He never missed it. He always made it, but there was talks for a long time, if you remember, that he would move to 155 because he was too big to go to 145, and now he's fighting at 135. And he did make it. He made it for the fight in December against Marlon Moraes, a fight that he lost by decision. It was a very close one. You could definitely make the argument that he won. The UFC is almost treating it like he won because they're moving forward with him getting the title shot. So it is a legitimate concern, and you have to wonder with all of the things going on in the world right now, the coronavirus, can he really get in the gym and train the way that he normally would? Can he get that cardio in? Can he get those pounds down? It's a legitimate concern. It truly, truly is. And again, he made it in December. They certainly are confident he'll make it again, but you just never know. It's a bit of a roll of the dice.
Poor Moraes. He's only lost twice in the last 5 years, and he's got Aldo jumping over him for another title shot. I mean, I'm not trying to be mean, but MMA is one of the weirdest things ever. I love the sport, but it's such a bizarre setup how things work, is it not?
Well, I mean, I would compare it. To me, it's more comparable to pro wrestling than it is to another sport, because the goal for the UFC. I mean, the best fighters in the world are in the UFC. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But the goal of the UFC is not necessarily to put out the best possible fights between the best possible fighters. That is a kind of a backup plan in some cases, but the goal of the UFC is to sell pay-per-views, right? I mean, let's be honest. The goal of the UFC is to make as much money as possible. They're a business, and by doing that, you have to put the biggest stars in the biggest roles, and sometimes that means foregoing people who deserve title shots because there's someone who has a bigger name there that is also somewhat deserving that is going to sell more pay-per-views. So you stick, that person, whether it be a woman or a man, into that spot, into that pay-per-view main event or that fight night main event. It's just the way it goes. It's been happening, since the dawn of the sport. I mean, that's just how it goes. I mean, there's really no way around that until we're at the point where people are willing to pay the same amount of money to see, someone like Demetrius Johnson, who for a long time, best fighter in the world, right? Pound for pound best fighter in the world for a long time, but didn't draw in those numbers. So until, the world is in a spot where MMA is popular enough that they're willing to see, the very best, not just the most popular, this will be the way it is. And I don't really necessarily see anything wrong with that. It's just, you have to understand what's going on.
Mark, before I let you go, you mentioned about the money situation. Obviously, it's been in the news this week about John Jones, Jorge Masvidal. They both have gone to social media multiple times complaining about negotiations with the UFC. And as you mentioned, COVID-19 has changed the entire world that we're in. Everything is kind of in flux and chaos. And while the UFC has put on multiple cards, let's be realistic. Without that gate, it has to affect their cash flow. So, do Masvidal and Jones have a real gripe when it comes to money, or is some of this just really the environment that we're in, that everyone is struggling and everyone really needs to work together to make all this work?
I can definitely see both sides of it. From the UFC's perspective, they have a certain amount of money they make every card from the gate, from the ticket revenue, and that is pretty much out the window right now. They're just not making it. So that at the end of the year, that money that they would have expected to make from the gate, from a big fight in Las Vegas, Conor McGregor pulls in, $5, $6, $7, $8, $9, $10 million for a big fight like that. You imagine Conor will fight again this year. It may not be in front of any fans. That is money that they expected to get on January 1st, and then at the end of the year, they're not going to be getting a large sum of that money. So that doesn't mean the UFC is not going to make money this year. They will make money this year. They're not going to lose money this year because they still have the TV contract with ESPN and all the other TV deals and broadcast deals across the world. Now, the situation with Jones and Masvidal, and Masvidal has been the most recent one. From his perspective, I feel like he said that they offered to pay him half the money that he got paid to fight Nate Diaz to fight Kamaru Usman, and he is saying, like, how is that fair? That wasn't even a title fight. This is a title fight against the welterweight champion. I'm a bigger star now than I was then. Why are you not going to pay me like that? So it's that kind of a situation, and everyone is always going to be jockeying back and forth for money and for negotiations. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, Masvidal made that point last night on Twitter when he was tweeting at Dana White. It's not the same as other sports, right? Because the UFC fighters don't have a union, so there's not that like inherent leverage they have against the UFC. So the UFC has a lot of the cards are on the UFC's side. So that's kind of what's going on right now, and they're trying to do what they can to build that leverage. John Jones said he's going to relinquish the title. They're both asking for their release. It's just one of those situations where they're trying to use whatever kind of leverage they do have, and it may work, it may not. I don't know, but we'll see how it plays out, I guess.
Well, if nothing else, Dana White and the UFC find ways to stay in the headlines. And with UFC 250 tonight, that's always what's the old saying? They say any news is good publicity for you. So UFC 250 tonight, ESPN Plus pay-per-view. Check out Marc Raimondi's article about Amanda Nunes. A great read about the perspective from Amanda's opponents about what kind of fighter she is like to fight. Follow Mark on Twitter at Marc_Raimondi. As all guests, Mark appeared here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Mark, appreciate your time today.
Thanks a lot. My pleasure.